Welcome to Sleepless History, where we explore the gentle rhythms of the past to help guide you into peaceful rest. I'm your host, and tonight we embark on a long, slow journey through 5 centuries that shaped the medieval world. This is the story of the period often called the Dark Ages, spanning from approximately 500 to 1000 AD. As you settle into comfort, there's no need to remember every detail. Simply allow the narrative to flow like a quiet river carrying you towards sleep. The Dark Ages weren't as dark as their name suggests, and tonight we'll wander through their corridors together, exploring the gradual transformations of empires, kingdoms, and cultures across Europe, the Mediterranean, and beyond. Take a deep breath, relax your shoulders, and let us begin our journey into the past. Chapter 1: The Twilight of Rome. Our story begins not with darkness, but with twilight. The year is 476 Anno Domini, and the Western Roman Empire, that great colossus which had dominated the Mediterranean world for centuries, is breathing its last. The Emperor Romulus Augustulus, a boy of perhaps 14 years, sits on a throne that has already lost its power. His name is almost tragically ironic. Romulus, after Rome's legendary founder, and Augustulus, Little Augustus, after Rome's first emperor. But there is nothing grand about this moment. The Gothic general Odoacer has marched into Italy. He doesn't burn Rome or slaughter its people. Instead, he simply informs young Romulus that his services are no longer required. The boy emperor is pensioned off to a villa in Campania, where he will live out his days in comfortable obscurity. Odoacer sends the imperial regalia, the crown and purple robes, eastward to Constantinople, to the emperor who still rules from that great city on the Bosporus. The message is clear. There is no longer a need for an emperor in the West. This moment, 476, is often marked as the end of the Western Roman Empire, though in truth the empire had been fragmenting for decades. But dates are helpful markers in the long river of time, and so we use this one as our starting point, the beginning of what later scholars would call the Dark Ages. But why dark? The term itself wasn't used by the people living through these times. They didn't wake up in the year 500 and declare they were living in a dark age. The label was applied much later, during the 14th and 15th centuries, by Italian scholars of the Renaissance, who looked back at the centuries separating them from classical Rome and saw a period of cultural and intellectual decline. To them, the light of classical learning had been extinguished, and Europe had stumbled through centuries of darkness before the rebirth, the renaissance of classical knowledge. This view is, of course, overly simple. History rarely moves in straight lines from light to dark and back to light again. The period from 500 to 1000 Anno Domini was indeed a time of tremendous change, of political fragmentation, of economic disruption, and in some regions of declining literacy and urban life. But it was also a time of new beginnings, of cultural synthesis, of the gradual formation of the European kingdoms that would define the medieval period and beyond. As Rome's authority faded in the West, what rushed in to fill the vacuum? Not chaos, though there was certainly upheaval, but rather a complex patchwork of successor kingdoms, each trying to maintain some thread of Roman administration while adapting to new realities. In Italy itself, Odoacer ruled for 17 years before being overthrown by another Germanic people, the Ostrogoths, led by their king Theodoric. Theodoric had been raised partly in Constantinople, educated in Roman ways, and he attempted to maintain the facade of Roman government. He kept the Roman Senate, preserved Roman law for his Roman subjects, and encouraged learning. His court at Ravenna became a centre where Roman and Gothic cultures mingled. The great philosopher Boethius served in Theodoric's government, at least until political intrigue led to Boethius's imprisonment and eventual execution in 524 or 525. In that prison cell, Boethius wrote one of the most influential works of the entire medieval period, The Consolation of Philosophy. In it, Lady Philosophy visits him and comforts him with discussions of fortune, fate, and the nature of happiness. The work would be translated and read throughout the Middle Ages, a bridge connecting classical philosophy to medieval thought. Even in what some call darkness, such lights continue to shine. Moving westward across the Mediterranean, we find the Vandal kingdom in North Africa. The Vandals had crossed from Spain into Africa in 429 and established a kingdom centered on Carthage. They became a naval power, raiding Mediterranean shipping and even sacking Rome itself in 455. Their kingdom would last until 534, when the Byzantine general Belisarius reconquered North Africa for the Emperor Justinian. In Hispania, the Iberian Peninsula, the Visigoths had established themselves, creating a kingdom that would last for nearly 3 centuries. They converted from Arian Christianity to Catholicism in 589 under King Reccared, which helped bridge the divide between the Gothic rulers and their Roman subjects. Toledo became their capital, a centre where Roman, Germanic, and eventually Islamic influences would blend. And in Gaul, ancient France, the Franks were rising to prominence. Under their king Clovis, who ruled from approximately 481 to 511, the Franks conquered much of Gaul and converted to Catholic Christianity. Clovis's conversion was a pivotal moment. According to the historian Gregory of Tours, writing later in the 6th century, Clovis's wife Clotilda, already a Christian, had long urged him to convert. During a desperate battle against the Alemanni, Clovis called upon the Christian God, promising conversion if granted victory. Victory came, and Clovis was baptized along with 3,000 of his warriors. Whether the story is precisely accurate matters less than its significance. By converting to Catholic Christianity rather than Arian Christianity, which many other Germanic peoples had adopted, Clovis aligned himself with the Roman population of Gaul and with the powerful bishops of the Catholic Church. This alliance between Frankish kings and the Catholic Church would shape European history for centuries. Let us pause here for a moment and consider the Church itself, for it is impossible to understand the Dark Ages without understanding the central role of Christianity. Chapter 2: The Church in a Changing World. As the political structures of Rome crumbled in the West, the Church remained. In fact, the Church often filled the vacuum left by collapsing imperial administration. Bishops became not just spiritual leaders, but temporal ones as well, responsible for their city's governance, food supply, and defense. The Pope in Rome, though not yet wielding the universal authority he would claim in later centuries, was becoming increasingly important as a source of stability and continuity. Pope Gregory I, known as Gregory the Great, who served from 590 to 604, exemplified this transformation. Gregory was born into a wealthy Roman family and had served as prefect of Rome before becoming a monk. As pope, he managed the vast estates of the church, organized food distribution to the poor of Rome, negotiated with Lombard invaders, and sent missionaries to convert pagan peoples. His pastoral writings, including the Pastoral Care, became guides for medieval clergy. He also reformed the liturgy, and Gregorian chant bears his name, though scholars debate how much he personally contributed to its development. Gregory's pontificate marked a crucial moment when the Bishop of Rome was becoming not just a religious leader, but a temporal power, a substitute for the absent emperor in the West. When the Lombards, another Germanic people, invaded Italy in 568, establishing a kingdom in the north and duchies further south, it was often the Pope who protected Rome and negotiated with these new powers. Monasticism was also transforming Christianity during this period. In the East, monks had been fleeing to the deserts of Egypt and Syria since the 3rd century, seeking isolation and spiritual perfection. In the West, monasticism took a different form, less extreme but more organized. Benedict of Nursia, who lived from approximately 480 to 547, established a monastery at Monte Cassino in Italy and wrote a rule for his monks. The rule of Saint Benedict emphasized moderation, stability, and community life. Monks were to remain in one monastery, following a daily schedule of prayer, work, and study. Idleness is the enemy of the soul, Benedict wrote, and so monks worked with their hands, copied manuscripts, and maintained learning even as classical education declined elsewhere. Benedictine monasteries became islands of literacy and learning, preserving classical texts that might otherwise have been lost. In Ireland, Christianity had taken root in the 5th century, brought there, according to tradition, by Patrick, a Romano-British missionary who had been enslaved in Ireland as a youth. Irish Christianity developed its own distinctive character, with powerful monasteries rather than bishops serving as the main centres of religious authority. Irish monks became famous for their learning and their missionary zeal. From the late 6th century onward, Irish monks began travelling to the continent, establishing monasteries and converting pagans. Columba founded a monastery on the island of Iona off the coast of Scotland in 563. Columbanus travelled through Gaul and into Italy, founding monasteries including Bobbio, which became a major centre of learning. These Irish missionaries brought with them beautifully illuminated manuscripts, demonstrating that artistic achievement hadn't died with Rome. Meanwhile, Christianity was spreading into England. The Anglo-Saxons, Germanic peoples from what is now northern Germany and Denmark, had been settling in Britain since the mid-5th century, filling the void left when Rome withdrew its legions around 410. These Anglo-Saxons were pagan, worshipping gods like Woden and Thor. Pope Gregory the Great sent a mission to convert them, led by a monk named Augustine, who landed in Kent in 597. Augustine was received by King Ethelbert of Kent, whose wife Bertha was already Christian. Ethelbert converted, and Augustine became the first Archbishop of Canterbury. Christianity spread gradually among the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, sometimes advancing, sometimes retreating. The process took over a century and involved both Roman missionaries from the south and Irish missionaries from the north, leading to disputes about practices like the calculation of Easter. These were resolved at the Synod of Whitby in 664 in favour of Roman practices, helping to bring the English Church into closer alignment with Rome. The conversion of the Anglo-Saxons illustrates a pattern repeated across Europe during the Dark Ages. Christianity spread gradually, often from the top down as kings converted and brought their people with them, and often involved negotiation and synthesis with existing customs rather than their complete elimination. Pagan festivals might become Christian feast days. Sacred groves might become sites for churches. The process was slow, uneven, and complex. Chapter 3: The Byzantine Continuation. While the West was fragmenting into successor kingdoms, the East remained united under the Roman Emperor in Constantinople. Today, we call this the Byzantine Empire, but its inhabitants would have been puzzled by that term. They called themselves Romans, and their emperor was the Roman Emperor, the legitimate successor of Augustus and Constantine. Constantinople was the new Rome, founded by Constantine the Great in 330. In the year 500, the Byzantine Empire was still a formidable power, controlling the Balkans, Greece, Anatolia, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and parts of North Africa. Its capital, Constantinople, was the greatest city in Christendom, with perhaps 400,000 or even 500,000 inhabitants at its height, surrounded by massive walls that made it nearly impregnable. The most famous Byzantine emperor of this period was Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565. Justinian dreamed of reconquering the lost Western territories and restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory. He was aided in this ambition by talented generals, particularly Belisarius and Narses. Belisarius first reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in a swift campaign in 533 to 534. Then he turned his attention to Italy, beginning a long and devastating war against the Ostrogoths that lasted from 535 to 554. Initially successful, Byzantine forces captured Ravenna and Rome, but the Goths resisted fiercely. Italy was ravaged by decades of warfare. When the Byzantines finally won, Italy was exhausted, depopulated, and economically ruined. Justinian also reconquered parts of southern Spain from the Visigoths. At the time of his death in 565, the Mediterranean was once again largely a Roman lake, but the reconquest was Pyrrhic. The constant warfare had drained the treasury and exhausted the empire's military resources. Just 3 years after Justinian's death, the Lombards invaded Italy, and the Byzantines could not stop them. Byzantine Italy was reduced to scattered holdings. Ravenna and its surrounding territory, Rome and its environs, southern Italy, and Sicily. Justinian's other great achievement was legal. He commissioned the compilation and rationalization of Roman law, a massive project that produced the Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law. This included the Code, a collection of imperial constitutions, the Digest, a compilation of writings by Roman jurists, the Institutes, a legal textbook, and the novels, Justinian's own new laws. This compilation preserved Roman legal thought and would become the foundation of legal systems across Europe in later centuries. Justinian also built. The most famous of his architectural projects was the Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom in Constantinople. Designed by the mathematicians Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, it was completed in 537. Its massive dome seemed to float above the central space, an engineering marvel. Byzantine chroniclers claimed that when Justinian first saw the completed church, he exclaimed, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee," referring to the ancient temple in Jerusalem. For nearly 1,000 years, until the Ottoman conquest in 1453, Hagia Sophia stood as the greatest church in Christendom. But Justinian's reign also saw catastrophe. In 541 to 542, a plague struck the Byzantine Empire, spreading from Egypt through the Mediterranean world. This was likely bubonic plague, the same disease that would return as the Black Death in the 14th century. The historian Procopius, who lived through it, described bodies piling up in the streets of Constantinople, towers filled with corpses, ships loaded with the dead and sent out to sea. Perhaps a quarter or even a third of Constantinople's population died. The plague returned in waves over the following decades, contributing to economic decline and military weakness. After Justinian, the Byzantine Empire faced increasing pressures. In the Balkans, Slavic peoples were migrating southward, eventually settling throughout the region and changing its ethnic makeup. The Avars, a steppe people related to the Huns, established a powerful empire in the Danube basin and repeatedly threatened Constantinople. But the greatest threat came from the east. The Byzantine Empire and the Sasanian Persian Empire, based in Iran and Mesopotamia, were ancient rivals. In the late 6th and early 7th centuries, their rivalry intensified into total war. The Persian king Khosrow II invaded Byzantine territory, capturing Jerusalem in 614, taking what was believed to be the true cross, the cross on which Jesus had been crucified, as a trophy. Persian armies reached the Bosporus, camping within sight of Constantinople. It seemed the Byzantine Empire might collapse entirely. But the Emperor Heraclius, who ruled from 610 to 641, launched a desperate counter-offensive. In a series of brilliant campaigns from 622 to 628, he invaded Persia itself, defeated Persian armies, and forced the Persians to sue for peace. The true cross was returned to Jerusalem in 630. It was a stunning reversal, and Heraclius was hailed as a saviour. But both empires were exhausted by decades of warfare. Their treasuries were empty, their armies depleted, their populations weary, and just as they paused to catch their breath, a new force exploded out of Arabia that would change the world forever. Chapter 4: The Rise of Islam. In the year 600, the Arabian Peninsula was divided among various tribes, some nomadic, some settled in trading cities like Mecca and Medina. Most Arabs were polytheists, though there were Jewish and Christian communities as well. Few could have predicted that within a century, Arab armies inspired by a new monotheistic faith would conquer an empire stretching from Spain to Central Asia. Muhammad ibn Abdullah was born in Mecca around 570. Orphaned as a child, he was raised by relatives and became a merchant. At around the age of 40, in approximately 610, he began receiving revelations that he believed came from God, transmitted through the angel Gabriel. These revelations, recited and eventually written down, became the Quran, the holy book of Islam. Muhammad's message was simple in its essentials. There is one God, Allah, and people should submit to His will. Islam means submission. The rich should care for the poor. The day of judgment is coming. Initially, Muhammad's preaching attracted only a small following in Mecca, and he faced opposition from the city's leading families who profited from traditional polytheistic pilgrimage practices. In 622, Muhammad and his followers migrated from Mecca to Medina, an event known as the Hijra, which marks the beginning of the Islamic calendar. In Medina, Muhammad became not just a religious leader, but a political and military one. Over the next decade, through a combination of warfare, negotiation, and alliance building, Muhammad united much of Arabia under Islam. In 630, he returned to Mecca in triumph. He died in 632. After Muhammad's death, leadership of the Muslim community passed to a series of caliphs or successors. The first 4 caliphs, known to Sunni Muslims as the rightly guided caliphs, presided over an explosion of conquest. Abu Bakr, the first caliph, who ruled from 632 to 634, consolidated control over Arabia. Umar ibn al-Khattab, who ruled from 634 to 644, oversaw the great conquests. Arab armies, motivated by religious zeal, the promise of plunder, and the leadership of talented generals, invaded both the Byzantine and Persian empires. The Byzantines and Persians, as we've noted, were exhausted from their recent wars. Their populations in Syria, Palestine, and Egypt had grievances against Constantinople's rule, particularly over theological disputes and heavy taxation. Some welcomed the Arabs as liberators from Byzantine oppression. In 636, Arab forces defeated a Byzantine army at the Battle of Yarmouk in Syria. Damascus fell, Jerusalem surrendered in 638, Alexandria and Egypt fell by 642. The Byzantine Empire lost its wealthiest provinces and was reduced to Anatolia, the Balkans, and scattered holdings in Italy and North Africa. The Persian Empire fared even worse. Defeated at the Battle of Qadisiyah in 636 or 637 and at Nahavand in 642, the Sasanian Empire collapsed. The last Sasanian king, Yazdegerd III, fled eastward and was murdered in 651. Persia, which had been the Byzantine Empire's great rival for centuries, ceased to exist as an independent power. Within 20 years of Muhammad's death, the Islamic Caliphate controlled territory stretching from Egypt to Iran. The conquests didn't stop. Arab forces moved westward across North Africa, eventually reaching the Atlantic Ocean and crossing into Spain. They moved eastward into Central Asia and the Indus Valley. They laid siege to Constantinople itself twice, in 674 to 678, and again in 717 to 718, but the great city's walls held firm, aided by the Byzantines' secret weapon, Greek fire, an incendiary liquid that burned on water. In the west, Arab armies crossed from North Africa into Spain in 711. The Visigothic kingdom, weakened by internal conflicts, collapsed rapidly. By 718, most of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim control. Crossing the Pyrenees into Gaul, Arab forces raided deep into Frankish territory. In 732, they were met by a Frankish army led by Charles Martel at a place somewhere between Tours and Poitiers. The Battle of Tours, or Poitiers, resulted in a Frankish victory and the death of the Arab commander. Arab expansion into Western Europe was halted. The Islamic Caliphate in the 7th and 8th centuries was the largest empire the world had seen since the Roman Empire. Under the Umayyad dynasty, which moved the capital from Medina to Damascus in 661, The Caliphate became a hereditary monarchy. The Umayyads ruled until 750, when they were overthrown by the Abbasid dynasty, which moved the capital to Baghdad. How did this rapid expansion affect the lands conquered? Initially, there was less disruption than one might expect. The Arab conquerors were a minority ruling over vast non-Arab, non-Muslim populations. Christians and Jews were allowed to keep their religions as people of the book, though they paid special taxes. Over time, conversion to Islam spread, sometimes through incentive, sometimes through conviction, sometimes through social pressure. Arabic became the language of administration, trade, and eventually culture across the conquered territories. Islamic civilization became a great synthesizer, absorbing and building upon Greek, Persian, Indian, and other traditions. In fields like mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy, Islamic scholars preserved ancient knowledge and made new advances. But that story belongs more to the period after 1000 than before. For our purposes, the rise of Islam marks a fundamental break. The Mediterranean, which had been a Roman lake, was now divided between Christian and Muslim powers. Trade routes were disrupted. Western Europe, cut off from Eastern trade and from the wealthy provinces of the former Roman Empire, turned inward, becoming more rural, more localized, more isolated. The unity of the Mediterranean world, already fracturing, was now definitively broken. Chapter 5. The Frankish Ascendancy. Let us return our attention to Western Europe, particularly to the Frankish kingdom, for it is among the Franks that we find the seeds of medieval European civilization. When Clovis died in 511, his kingdom was divided among his 4 sons, following Frankish custom. This began a pattern that would repeat throughout the Merovingian dynasty, the dynasty founded by Clovis. The kingdom would be divided, brothers would fight, the kingdom would be reunited, and then divided again. Despite this instability, Frankish power gradually expanded, absorbing Burgundy, Provence, and other regions. The Merovingian kings themselves, however, became increasingly weak. Real power shifted to the mayors of the palace, powerful aristocrats who nominally served the king but effectively ruled in their place. The Merovingian kings of the 7th and 8th centuries are sometimes called the do-nothing kings, puppets controlled by their mayors of the palace. One family of mayors of the palace, the Pippinids, later called the Carolingians, gradually consolidated power. Charles Martel, whom we've already mentioned as the victor at Tours, was mayor of the palace from 717 to 741. His son, Pippin the Short, decided to formalize what was already reality. With the Pope's blessing, Pippin deposed the last Merovingian king in 751 and became king himself, founding the Carolingian dynasty. Why did the Pope support this usurpation? Because Pippin offered the papacy military protection. The Lombards in Italy were threatening Rome. The Byzantine Empire was too distant and too weak to help. In 754, Pippin crossed the Alps, defeated the Lombards, and donated conquered territory to the Pope, creating the Papal States, a band of territory across central Italy that the popes would rule for over 1,000 years. This alliance between the Carolingian kings and the papacy would shape European politics for centuries. Pippin's son was Charles, known to history as Charlemagne Charles the Great. Charlemagne ruled from 768 to 814, and his reign marks the high point of the Carolingian Empire and, in many ways, the turning point between the Dark Ages and the medieval period proper. Charlemagne was a warrior king who spent most of his reign on campaign. He conquered the Lombard kingdom in Italy, adding the title King of the Lombards to his own. He campaigned in Spain, establishing a frontier march, a defensive border region south of the Pyrenees. He fought the Saxons in northern Germany in a brutal war that lasted over 30 years. The Saxons were pagans who resisted Frankish rule and Christianity. Charlemagne's methods were harsh: forced conversions, mass executions, deportations. Eventually, Saxony was subdued and Christianized. By 800, Charlemagne ruled a vast territory encompassing modern France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Western Germany, Switzerland, northern Italy, and parts of Spain. It was the largest unified political entity in Western Europe since the fall of Rome. On Christmas Day, 800, Charlemagne was in Rome attending Mass at St. Peter's Basilica. As he rose from prayer, Pope Leo III placed a crown on his head and acclaimed him Emperor of the Romans. The congregation joined in the acclamation. Whether Charlemagne was surprised, as his biographer Einhard later claimed, or whether the coronation was carefully planned, is debated by historians. What mattered was the symbolism. The Roman Empire in the West had been revived, not in Rome, but among the Franks, not by a Roman, but by a Germanic king. The coronation outraged the Byzantines, who saw themselves as the legitimate continuation of Rome. There could be only one Roman emperor, and he ruled in Constantinople. For years there was tension, but eventually the Byzantines grudgingly recognized Charlemagne as emperor, though perhaps not as Roman emperor. Charlemagne was more than just a conqueror. He sought to reform and improve his realm. He promoted learning, inviting scholars from across Europe to his court at Aachen. The Anglo-Saxon scholar Alcuin of York became Charlemagne's chief educational advisor. Alcuin established a palace school and encouraged the copying and preservation of classical texts. Monasteries throughout the empire became centers of learning, implementing educational reforms. This cultural revival is known as the Carolingian Renaissance. It wasn't a renaissance on the scale of the Italian Renaissance of later centuries, but it was significant. A new script, Carolingian minuscule, was developed, making texts easier to read. Classical Latin authors like Virgil and Cicero were copied and preserved. Without the Carolingian Renaissance, many classical texts would have been lost. Charlemagne also attempted to standardize law, administration, and religious practice throughout his empire. He sent out officials called missi dominici, messengers of the Lord, to supervise local counts and ensure justice. He convened councils to address theological disputes and to reform the church. He built roads and bridges. He even attempted to dig a canal connecting the Rhine and Danube rivers, though the project was abandoned. When Charlemagne died in 814, he left behind an empire and a legacy. But the empire didn't last. Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, succeeded him and tried to hold the empire together. But Louis had 3 sons, and Frankish tradition called for dividing the kingdom. After Louis's death in 840, his sons fought a civil war. In 843, they agreed to the Treaty of Verdun, dividing the empire into 3 parts. Charles the Bald received West Francia, roughly modern France. Louis the German received East Francia, roughly modern Germany. Lothair, the eldest, received the title of emperor and a middle kingdom stretching from the North Sea through Burgundy and into Italy. This middle kingdom, Lotharingia, was geographically incoherent and would be fought over for centuries. The Treaty of Verdun marks, in a sense, the birth of France and Germany as separate entities. The division weakened the empire just as new threats were emerging. From the south, Muslim raiders from North Africa and Spain attacked Mediterranean coasts. From the east, Magyar horsemen from the Eurasian steppes raided into Germany and Italy, and from the north came the Vikings. Chapter 6. The Viking Age. The Vikings, or Norsemen, were seafaring people from Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. In the late 8th century, they began venturing beyond their homelands, initially as raiders, later as traders, settlers, and conquerors. The Viking Age, traditionally dated from 793 to around 1066, represents one of the most dynamic and disruptive periods of the Dark Ages. The first recorded Viking raid occurred in 793, when Norse raiders attacked the monastery of Lindisfarne off the northeast coast of England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records the event with horror. The ravages of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. Monasteries, wealthy but poorly defended, became favourite targets. Why did the Vikings suddenly burst onto the European scene? Several factors likely contributed. Scandinavia's population may have been growing, creating pressure for expansion. Improvements in shipbuilding technology gave the Norse superior vessels, the famous longships that were fast, manoeuvrable, and could navigate both open ocean and shallow rivers. Political consolidation in Scandinavia may have pushed out younger sons and rivals who sought fortune abroad, and simple opportunity beckoned. Europe was divided and relatively weak. The Vikings were skilled sailors and navigators. They followed the coasts, used landmarks, observed the sun and stars, and possibly even used primitive compasses. Their longships, with shallow drafts and both sails and oars, could cross the North Sea, navigate rivers deep into the continent, and even be portaged overland when necessary. In the early 9th century, Viking raids intensified. They struck Ireland repeatedly, eventually establishing settlements and the port cities of Dublin, Limerick, and Waterford. They raided the Frankish coast and ventured up the Seine River, threatening Paris. In 845, a large Viking fleet sailed up the Seine and besieged Paris. The Franks paid them a huge ransom to leave, setting a dangerous precedent. England suffered greatly. Different Viking groups, primarily Danes, raided extensively. In 865, a great heathen army of Vikings invaded England with the intent not just to raid, but to conquer and settle. Over the next decade, they conquered the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, and Mercia. Only Wessex in the south, under King Alfred, resisted. Alfred the Great, who ruled Wessex from 871 to 899, is one of the heroes of English history. After initial defeats, Alfred rallied, defeated the Vikings at the Battle of Edington in 878, and forced their leader Guthrum to convert to Christianity and withdraw to the north and east. The Treaty of Wedmore established a boundary. The Vikings controlled the north and east, an area known as the Danelaw, while Alfred controlled Wessex and parts of Mercia. Alfred fortified towns, built a navy, reformed the army, and promoted learning and literacy. He even translated Latin works into Old English himself. Alfred's successors gradually reconquered the Danelaw, reuniting England under a single Anglo-Saxon monarchy by the mid-10th century, but Viking influence remained. Scandinavian settlers in the Danelaw contributed to English culture, language and DNA. Place names ending in by or thorp indicate Viking settlement. Vikings also ventured westward across the Atlantic. They settled in the Faroe Islands, then Iceland, which was largely uninhabited except for a few Irish monks. The settlement of Iceland began in 874. By 930, Iceland had a substantial Norse population and established the Althing, an assembly of free men, one of the world's oldest parliaments. From Iceland, Vikings sailed further west. Eric the Red explored and settled Greenland around 985. From Greenland, his son Leif Erikson explored the coast of North America around the year 1000, establishing a short-lived settlement at a place they called Vinland, probably in Newfoundland. The Norse presence in North America didn't last, but it demonstrates the extraordinary range of Viking exploration. In the east, Swedish Vikings, known as Varangians or Rus, followed the rivers of Eastern Europe southward toward the riches of Constantinople and the Islamic world. They established trade routes, founded settlements, and eventually created political entities. According to the Russian Primary Chronicle, a later medieval text, the Slavic tribes of the region invited the Varangian leader Rurik to rule over them in 862. Rurik's successors established the Kievan Rus state, centered on the city of Kiev. This state is considered the ancestor of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. The Varangians traded furs, slaves, and amber for silver, silk, and other luxury goods from Constantinople and the Islamic world. Some served as mercenaries in the Byzantine army. The Varangian Guard, an elite unit of the Byzantine emperor's personal bodyguard, was composed of Norse and later Anglo-Saxon warriors. The famous Anglo-Saxon king Harold Godwinson, defeated by William the Conqueror at Hastings in 1066, may have earlier served in the Varangian Guard. In Western Europe, Vikings eventually settled in northern France. Beginning in the mid-9th century, Vikings repeatedly raided up the Seine. In 911, the Frankish king Charles the Simple decided to try a different approach. He granted a Viking leader named Rollo land at the mouth of the Seine and the title of Duke in exchange for Rollo's allegiance and his promise to defend against other Vikings. Rollo converted to Christianity and became the first Duke of Normandy. His descendants, the Normans, would become one of the most dynamic forces in medieval Europe, eventually conquering England in 1066, southern Italy and Sicily. The Vikings were not just raiders and conquerors, they were also traders, craftsmen, poets and explorers. They had a rich oral tradition, later written down in the Icelandic sagas, which tell of heroes, feuds, voyages, and the gods of Norse paganism. They produced intricate metalwork, carved rune stones, and built impressive ships and halls. By the late 10th and early 11th centuries, the Viking Age was waning. The Scandinavian kingdoms were consolidating and Christianizing. Denmark, Norway, and Sweden were becoming Christian kingdoms more interested in internal development than external raiding. The last great wave of Viking activity was the conquest of England by the Danish king Canute the Great in 1016. But even Canute was a Christian king ruling a Christian kingdom. The Viking Age left a lasting mark on Europe. It disrupted, destroyed, and terrified, but it also connected distant regions, introduced new settlers and cultures, and contributed to the emergence of new political entities like Normandy, the Kievan Rus, and a united England. Chapter 7: Intellectual and Cultural Life. Let us pause in our narrative of kingdoms and conquests to consider the intellectual and cultural life of the Dark Ages. It's easy to focus on warfare and political fragmentation, and to overlook the quieter achievements in learning, art, and thought. As we've noted, literacy declined in Western Europe after the fall of Rome. The complex Roman educational system, based on grammar, rhetoric, and law, largely disappeared. Urban life declined in many regions, and with it, the schools and libraries that had supported learning. In the countryside, most people were illiterate farmers, focused on survival. But learning didn't disappear entirely. It retreated to the monasteries and, to a lesser extent, to the courts of kings and bishops. Monasteries became the primary centres of literacy and learning in the early Middle Ages. Monks copied manuscripts, preserving not only Christian texts like the Bible and the writings of the Church Fathers, but also classical works by authors like Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero. Without the work of these monastic scribes, many classical texts would have been lost forever. The process of copying manuscripts was laborious. Each book had to be copied by hand, letter by letter, onto parchment made from animal skins. A single Bible might take years to complete. Scribes worked in scriptoria, rooms set aside for writing, often cold and poorly lit. Copying was considered a spiritual discipline, a form of prayer. Errors crept in, of course, but scribes tried to be accurate, and they sometimes added beautiful illuminations, decorative borders, and illustrations to the pages. Some of the most famous illuminated manuscripts come from this period. The Book of Kells, created by Irish monks around 800, is a masterpiece of medieval art, with intricate interlaced patterns, vivid colours, and imaginative detail. The Lindisfarne Gospels, created in Northumbria around 700, are similarly magnificent. These books were made to glorify God and to serve as treasures for their monasteries and churches. The curriculum in monastic schools was based on the 7 liberal arts, divided into the trivium and quadrivium. The trivium consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and logic, the arts of language and argument. The quadrivium consisted of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the mathematical arts. This curriculum had roots in classical education, but was Christianized and simplified. The goal was to train monks to read scripture, conduct the liturgy, and understand theology. Some monasteries became renowned centres of learning. Bobbio in Italy, founded by the Irish monk Columbanus, had a famous library. Monte Cassino, the mother house of Benedictine monasticism, was another centre. In England, the monasteries of Wearmouth and Jarrow produced the Venerable Bede, perhaps the greatest scholar of the early Middle Ages. Bede, who lived from 673 to 735, spent his entire adult life at Jarrow. He wrote extensively on theology, biblical commentary, and history. His most famous work is the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed in 731, which tells the story of the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons to Christianity. Bede was a careful historian, citing his sources and attempting to verify information. His work is invaluable for understanding early medieval England. Bede also wrote on computers, the calculation of the date of Easter, and he popularized the use of the Anno Domini dating system. Before Bede, various dating systems were used. By consistently using the Anno Domini system in his historical works, Bede helped it become the standard in Western Europe. The Carolingian Renaissance, which we discussed earlier, represents a high point of early medieval learning. Charlemagne gathered scholars from across Europe, Alcuin from England, Paul the Deacon from Italy, Theodulf from Spain. They reformed education, established schools, corrected manuscripts, and wrote commentaries and treatises. The Carolingian minuscule script they developed was clear and legible, making texts easier to read and copy. This script eventually evolved into the lowercase letters we use today. But the Carolingian Renaissance was centered on the court and on major monasteries. It didn't reach the majority of the population, who remained illiterate. And after the Carolingian Empire fragmented in the mid-9th century, intellectual life declined again in many regions, particularly as Viking and Magyar raids disrupted monasteries. In the Byzantine Empire, learning continued at a higher level throughout the Dark Ages. Constantinople had schools, libraries, and a literate bureaucracy. Greek remained the language of learning, and Byzantines had direct access to classical Greek philosophy, literature, and science. Byzantine scholars preserved and commented upon ancient texts. In the 9th century, a revival of learning, sometimes called the Byzantine Renaissance, saw scholars like Photius, Patriarch of Constantinople, compiling summaries of hundreds of ancient works. Islamic civilization also preserved and advanced learning. As Arabs conquered the former territories of the Byzantine and Persian empires, they encountered Greek, Persian, and Indian scholarship. Beginning in the 8th century and accelerating in the 9th, a translation movement brought Greek philosophical and scientific works into Arabic. Scholars in Baghdad, Damascus, and later Cordoba studied Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Ptolemy, and Galen. They didn't just preserve this knowledge, they built upon it, making advances in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and philosophy. In the Dark Ages, the Islamic world was, in many ways, the intellectual center of the Mediterranean and Middle East. But the story of Islamic civilization's golden age largely falls outside our period, reaching its peak after 1000. Chapter 8. Daily Life and Economy. What was life like for ordinary people during the Dark Ages? For most, life was harsh, short, and centered on agriculture. The vast majority of the population lived in the countryside as peasants, farming the land. Compared to Roman times, there was less trade, fewer cities, and less use of money. Many regions shifted toward a more localized subsistence economy. Peasants grew their own food, made their own clothes, and built their own shelters. They might never travel more than a few miles from where they were born. Agriculture was the foundation of the economy. The main crops were grains, wheat, barley, oats, and rye. Peasants also grew vegetables, kept chickens and pigs, and might have a cow or ox. Farming was hard work and vulnerable to the weather. A bad harvest meant hunger or even starvation. Agricultural technology was relatively simple, but did see some improvements during this period. The heavy plough, which could turn the thick soils of northern Europe more effectively than the light plough used in the Mediterranean, became more widespread. The three-field system of crop rotation, in which one field was planted in autumn, one in spring, and one left fallow, increased productivity and spread during the later Dark Ages. Most peasants lived in small villages, clustered near fields and pastures. Houses were simple, wooden or wattle and daub structures with thatched roofs, usually consisting of 1 or 2 rooms. Animals might share the living space, providing warmth in winter. Light came from the fire and from simple oil lamps or candles. Most people owned very few possessions. Social structure varied by region and evolved over time. In the later Roman Empire, there had been a class of free peasant landowners. After the invasions and the establishment of the Germanic kingdoms, many peasants fell into dependence on local lords. By the 9th and 10th centuries, a system that would later be called feudalism was emerging, at least in parts of Western Europe, like Francia. In this system, the king granted land to nobles in exchange for military service. The nobles, in turn, granted portions of their land to lesser nobles or knights. At the bottom, peasants worked the land, giving a portion of their produce to their lord and owing labour service, working the lord's fields, maintaining roads, building fortifications. Many peasants became serfs, legally bound to the land and unable to leave without their lord's permission. They were not slaves, but they were not free. The lord, in theory, provided protection and justice. He might have a fortified manor house or, later, a castle. He held a court to settle disputes among his peasants. He was responsible for defence, though in practice, peasants often suffered during warfare. Women's roles varied by class. Peasant women worked alongside men in the fields, cared for children, prepared food, spun thread, and wove cloth. Noble women managed large households, oversaw estates when their husbands were away, and sometimes wielded significant power. A few women, like the Empress Theodora, wife of Justinian, or the Frankish Queen Brunhilde, exercised political power in their own right. The church also offered roles for women. Nuns lived in convents, following rules similar to those of monks. Convents could be centres of learning and land ownership. Some abbesses ruled over double monasteries of men and women and wielded considerable authority. Life expectancy was low by modern standards. Infant mortality was high. Perhaps a third or more of children died before their 5th birthday. Disease, malnutrition, accidents, and violence claimed many lives. A person who survived childhood might live into their 40s or 50s, but few reached old age. Warfare, particularly in border regions or during invasions, was a constant threat. Religion permeated daily life. The church calendar structured the year with feast days and fasts. Sunday was a day of rest and worship. Festivals like Christmas and Easter were major communal celebrations. Saints were venerated, and their relics, physical remains or objects associated with them, were believed to have miraculous powers. Pilgrimages to holy sites were common. Despite hardship, there was also community, festivity, and moments of joy. Peasants gathered for harvests, weddings, and festivals. Storytellers, minstrels, and travelling performers brought entertainment. Games, songs, and dances provided diversion. Trade, though reduced from Roman levels, didn't disappear. Local markets allowed peasants to sell surplus produce and buy goods they couldn't make themselves. Long-distance trade continued, especially in luxury goods. Byzantine silk, Eastern spices and northern furs moved along trade routes, though in smaller quantities than in Roman times. Certain regions and cities remained important commercial centres. Venice, originally a refuge for people fleeing barbarian invasions, grew wealthy trading between Byzantium and Western Europe. In the North Sea and Baltic, Frisian and later Viking traders moved goods. The Champagne region in France would later become famous for its trade fairs. Coins were minted and used, especially for large transactions, but barter was common for everyday exchanges. The disruption of trade routes and the fragmentation of political authority led to a proliferation of local currencies, often debased with less silver content than earlier Roman coins. Slavery existed, but was declining in Western Europe during this period. The Church discouraged the enslavement of Christians, though this didn't prevent Christians from enslaving non-Christians. Serfdom, which bound peasants to the land but recognized them as human beings with certain rights, gradually replaced outright slavery in many regions. In the Islamic world and in Eastern Europe, slavery remained more prevalent. Overall, life in the Dark Ages was marked by localism, agrarian economy, and the pervasive influence of the Church. It was a world very different from the urbanized, monetized, and administratively sophisticated Roman Empire, and also different from the more commercialized and centralized kingdoms that would emerge after 1000. Chapter 9. The Ottonian Dynasty and the Holy Roman Empire. As the 10th century dawned, Western Europe was emerging from the worst disruptions of the Dark Ages. Viking raids were diminishing as Scandinavian kingdoms Christianized and consolidated. The Magyars, steppe warriors who had raided Central Europe mercilessly, were about to be stopped. And in Germany, a new dynasty was about to create an empire. East Francia, the eastern portion of the Carolingian Empire, had fragmented into several powerful duchies: Saxony, Franconia, Swabia, Bavaria, and Lotharingia. These duchies were ruled by dukes who owed nominal allegiance to the king, but often acted independently. The last Carolingian king of East Francia died in 911, and the dukes elected one of their own, Conrad of Franconia, as king. When Conrad died in 918, they elected Henry of Saxony, known as Henry the Fowler. Henry I, who ruled from 919 to 936, strengthened royal authority and defended against Magyar raids. He fortified towns, built a cavalry force, and won victories against the Magyars. When he died, his son Otto succeeded him. Otto I, known as Otto the Great, ruled from 936 to 973 and became the most powerful ruler in Western Europe. Early in his reign, he faced rebellions from dukes and even from his own family, but he suppressed them and asserted his authority. In 955, a massive Magyar army invaded Germany. Otto met them at the Battle of Lechfeld near Augsburg. Otto's forces won a decisive victory, destroying the Magyar army. The Magyars retreated to the Carpathian Basin, the region of modern Hungary, and never raided Germany again. In fact, the Magyars soon settled down, converted to Christianity, and founded the Kingdom of Hungary. Otto's victory at Lechfeld earned him immense prestige. He expanded his influence into Italy, intervening in the chaotic politics of the Italian kingdom. In 961, he marched to Rome and was crowned emperor by Pope John XII. Like Charlemagne before him, Otto was reviving the Roman Empire in the West. The empire Otto and his successors ruled is called the Holy Roman Empire, though it wouldn't be officially known by that name for some time. It consisted primarily of Germany and northern Italy. It was neither holy nor Roman, nor much of an empire in the sense of a centralized state, as the French philosopher Voltaire would later quip. But it was a significant political entity that would last in various forms until 1806. The Holy Roman Emperors saw themselves as the successors of Charlemagne and of the Roman Caesars, protectors of the Church and of Christendom. But their actual power varied. They were elected by the great princes of Germany, which meant they needed to maintain alliances and couldn't always enforce their will. Conflicts between emperors and popes over authority, particularly over who had the right to appoint bishops, would dominate much of medieval politics in later centuries. Otto II and Otto III, successors to Otto the Great, continued the dynasty's rule. Otto III, who ruled from 983 to 1002, was particularly ambitious, dreaming of a restored Roman Empire with its capital in Rome. He even had himself depicted in imperial regalia modelled on Byzantine emperors, but his early death at age 21 cut short his plans. The Ottonian dynasty ended with Henry II, who died childless in 1024, but the idea of the Holy Roman Empire endured. Future German kings would continue to seek coronation as emperor, travelling to Rome and asserting their authority over Italy. The Ottonian period also saw a cultural revival in Germany, sometimes called the Ottonian Renaissance. Monasteries flourished, producing illuminated manuscripts in a distinctive style. Architecture, particularly church architecture, advanced. The Ottonians were great patrons of the church, founding bishoprics and monasteries, seeing the church as a partner in governance. Chapter 10. The Christianization of Europe. By the year 1000, Christianity had spread across most of Europe, but the process had taken centuries and was still ongoing in some regions. We've already discussed the conversion of the Anglo-Saxons, the Franks, and other early Germanic peoples. As the Dark Ages progressed, missionary activity continued, often supported by kings and emperors who saw Christianization as a way to extend their influence. The Saxons in Germany, as we noted, were forcibly converted by Charlemagne in a brutal campaign. The Frisians in the Low Countries were converted in the 7th and 8th centuries by missionaries like Willibrord and Boniface. Boniface, an English monk, became known as the Apostle to the Germans for his missionary work in the 8th century. He famously cut down the sacred oak of Thor at Geismar to demonstrate the powerlessness of pagan gods. When no divine retribution struck him, many converted. Boniface was later martyred by pagans in Frisia in 754. In Scandinavia, Christianization came later and more gradually. Denmark began converting in the 9th century. King Harald Bluetooth, who ruled in the mid to late 10th century, officially converted and promoted Christianity, erecting a famous runestone proclaiming that he made the Danes Christian. Norway was Christianized in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, often through the efforts of kings like Olaf Tryggvason and Olaf Haraldsson, who used both persuasion and force. Sweden was the last Scandinavian kingdom to fully convert, with Christianity becoming dominant only in the 11th and 12th centuries. In Eastern Europe, the process was also gradual. The Slavic peoples who had settled throughout the Balkans and Eastern Europe were pagan. Byzantine missionaries worked to convert them to Orthodox Christianity, while Western missionaries promoted Catholicism. This led to a division that persists to this day, with some Slavic peoples becoming Catholic and others Orthodox. The most famous Byzantine missionaries were the brothers Cyril and Methodius, who worked among the Slavs in the 9th century. They created an alphabet for Slavic languages, now called Cyrillic, and translated religious texts. Their work laid the foundation for Slavic Orthodox Christianity. The Bulgars, a Turkic people who had established a kingdom in the Balkans, converted to Orthodox Christianity in the 9th century under Khan Boris I. The Serbs and other South Slavic peoples followed. In 988, Prince Vladimir of Kiev, leader of the Kievan Rus, converted to Orthodox Christianity. According to legend, he sent envoys to investigate different religions. When they attended a service in Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, they reported, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth." Vladimir was baptized, married a Byzantine princess, and made Christianity the official religion of Kiev. His baptism is a foundational event in Russian history. The Poles adopted Catholic Christianity in the late 10th century under Duke Mieszko I, aligning with the Western Church and the Holy Roman Empire. The Hungarians, as mentioned, converted after their defeat at Lechfeld with King Stephen I, who ruled from around 997 to 1038, completing the Christianization and receiving a crown from the Pope. The conversion of Europe was rarely a simple matter of missionaries preaching and people accepting the new faith. It often involved political calculation by rulers seeking alliances, legitimacy, or access to the literate bureaucracy the Church provided. It involved blending Christianity with existing beliefs and practices. Pagan festivals became Christian holidays. Sacred springs became sites of pilgrimage to saints. The old gods sometimes lingered as folk beliefs. The Church itself was not monolithic. There were differences in practice and theology between the Eastern Orthodox Church, centered in Constantinople, and the Western Catholic Church, centered in Rome. These differences, involving issues like the filioque clause in the Creed, the use of leavened versus unleavened bread in the Eucharist, and the authority of the Pope, gradually widened. In 1054, the Great Schism formally split the Church into Eastern Orthodox and Roman Catholic, though the division had been developing for centuries. By the end of the Dark Ages, Europe was a Christian continent, united in faith if not in politics. The Church was the dominant cultural force, shaping art, literature, law, and daily life. Monasteries dotted the landscape. Cathedrals and churches were the largest and most impressive buildings in most towns. The Pope in Rome and the Patriarch in Constantinople were figures of immense authority. Christianity had become inseparable from European identity. Chapter 11. Spain and the Umayyad Caliphate. While much of our focus has been on Francia, Germany, and England, we should not overlook the Iberian Peninsula, where a unique situation developed during the Dark Ages. As we discussed, Muslim forces crossed from North Africa into Spain in 711 and quickly conquered most of the peninsula. The Visigothic kingdom collapsed. Only in the mountainous north did small Christian kingdoms survive: Asturias, Leon, Navarre, and eventually Castile and Aragon. These kingdoms would gradually expand southward over the following centuries in what is called the Reconquista, the reconquest. But during the period we're discussing, Muslim-ruled Spain was a major power. Initially, Spain was a province of the Umayyad Caliphate, ruled from Damascus. But when the Abbasids overthrew the Umayyads in 750 and slaughtered the Umayyad family, one prince escaped. Abd al-Rahman I fled across North Africa and into Spain, where he rallied support and established an independent emirate based in Cordoba in 756. His successors ruled Al-Andalus, as Muslim Spain was called, as emirs, princes, nominally subordinate to the caliph in Baghdad, but in practice independent. In 929, Abd al-Rahman III declared himself caliph, establishing the Caliphate of Cordoba, directly challenging the Abbasid claim to leadership of the Muslim world. The Caliphate of Cordoba reached its peak in the 10th century. Cordoba became one of the largest and most cultured cities in Europe, with perhaps several 100,000 inhabitants. It had paved streets, public baths, libraries, and mosques. The Great Mosque of Cordoba, with its famous horseshoe arches and columns, was one of the architectural wonders of the age. Al-Andalus was a multi-ethnic and multi-religious society. Muslims ruled, but Christians and Jews lived under their authority as dhimmis, protected peoples. They paid special taxes, but were allowed to practice their religions. Many Christians and Jews learned Arabic and participated in the flourishing culture. Scholars in Al-Andalus studied philosophy, mathematics, medicine, and astronomy, translating Greek works from Arabic and producing original scholarship. But Al-Andalus was not without conflict. There were tensions between Arabs and Berbers, between Muslims and Christians, and between different Islamic sects. In the early 11th century, the Caliphate of Cordoba collapsed into civil war, fragmenting into small kingdoms called taifas. This fragmentation allowed the Christian kingdoms of the north to expand, though that story extends beyond our period. The interaction between Christian and Muslim Spain was complex, involving warfare, diplomacy, trade, and cultural exchange. Christian knights sometimes served Muslim rulers, and Muslim soldiers sometimes fought for Christian kings. Mozarabs, Christians living under Muslim rule, maintained their faith and Latin language, but adopted many aspects of Arab culture. Mudajars, Muslims living under Christian rule, faced a similar situation. Spain during the Dark Ages was a frontier zone, a place where different cultures and religions met, clashed, and blended. It was also a conduit through which Islamic learning, including preserved Greek philosophy and science, would eventually reach the rest of Europe, contributing to the intellectual revival of the 12th century. Chapter 12. The Byzantine Struggle for Survival. Returning eastward, the Byzantine Empire during the Dark Ages faced existential threats but managed to survive and even, at times, to thrive. After the Arab conquests of the 7th century, the Byzantines had lost Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and North Africa. The empire was reduced to Anatolia, the Balkans, parts of Italy, and scattered islands. Constantinople itself was besieged twice by Arab forces, but held firm. The loss of the wealthy eastern provinces was a catastrophic blow. The empire's population and tax base shrank dramatically. The army had to be reorganized. The Byzantines developed the theme system, dividing Anatolia and the Balkans into military districts called themes, each commanded by a general and garrisoned by soldiers who were granted land in exchange for military service. This created a more resilient defense, but also decentralized power. In the 8th century, the Byzantine Empire was convulsed by the iconoclast controversy. Iconoclasm, the breaking of images, was a theological and political dispute over the use of religious icons. Some emperors and bishops argued that icons were idolatrous and should be destroyed. Others defended icons as legitimate aids to worship. The controversy involved complex theology, but it also had political dimensions, pitting emperors against popes and monasteries. The iconoclast emperors, particularly Leo III and Constantine V in the 8th century, banned icons and persecuted those who venerated them. Monasteries, which produced and housed many icons, were particular targets. The controversy caused a rift between the Byzantine Empire and the papacy in Rome, which opposed iconoclasm. Eventually, in 843, iconoclasm was definitively rejected, and the veneration of icons was restored, an event celebrated in the Orthodox Church as the triumph of orthodoxy. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the Byzantine Empire experienced a military and cultural revival. Strong emperors like Basil I, founder of the Macedonian dynasty, and his successors pushed back against the Arabs, reconquering parts of Anatolia, Syria, and even briefly Crete and Cyprus. The Byzantine navy controlled the eastern Mediterranean. Missionaries spread Orthodox Christianity, as we've discussed, to the Slavs. Byzantium also faced new threats. In the Balkans, the Bulgarians established a powerful empire. Under Tsar Simeon the Great, who ruled from 893 to 927, Bulgaria expanded dramatically and repeatedly threatened Constantinople. The Byzantines eventually defeated the Bulgarians in a series of wars in the early 11th century, annexing their territory. Byzantine culture flourished during this period. The 9th and 10th centuries saw a revival of learning, art, and literature. Scholars copied and studied ancient texts. Mosaics and frescoes decorated churches. The Byzantines saw themselves as the true heirs of Rome, preserving Roman law, Greek learning, and Christian orthodoxy. They looked upon the kingdoms of the West as crude and barbaric, upstarts claiming a Roman heritage they hadn't earned. The relationship between Byzantium and the West was complex. There were diplomatic exchanges, trade, and occasional cooperation against common enemies, but there was also rivalry and mistrust. The coronation of Charlemagne as emperor in 800 was seen as an affront. The growing power of the papacy and the theological differences between East and West created friction. By the end of the Dark Ages, around 1000, the Byzantine Empire was still a major power, though smaller than in its heyday. It would continue for another 4.5 centuries, finally falling to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. But the era of Byzantine dominance in the Mediterranean was over, and the centre of gravity in Europe was shifting westward. Chapter 13: Britain and the Anglo-Saxon Kingdoms. Let us return our gaze to Britain, which during the Dark Ages was a land of multiple kingdoms, languages, and cultures. After the Roman legions withdrew around 410, Roman Britain fragmented. The Romano-British population, left to defend themselves, faced raids from Picts in the north and from Anglo-Saxon raiders from across the North Sea. According to later tradition, British leaders invited Saxon mercenaries to help defend against the Picts, but the Saxons rebelled and began settling the land themselves. Over the course of the 5th and 6th centuries, waves of Angles, Saxons and Jutes migrated to Britain, settling primarily in what is now England. They brought their Germanic languages, which evolved into Old English, and their pagan religion. The Romano-British population was pushed westward into Wales, Cornwall, and across the sea to Brittany in France, or was absorbed by the newcomers. Britain fragmented into numerous small kingdoms. By the 7th century, there were 7 major kingdoms, known to later historians as the Heptarchy: Northumbria, Mercia, East Anglia, Essex, Kent, Sussex, and Wessex. These kingdoms fought each other for dominance, with different kingdoms rising to prominence at different times. In the 7th century, Northumbria was the most powerful kingdom. King Edwin, who ruled from 616 to 633, converted to Christianity, and Northumbria became a centre of learning. The monasteries of Lindisfarne, Wearmouth and Jarrow, where Bede lived, produced some of the finest scholarship and art of the age. In the 8th century, Mercia dominated under kings like Ethelbald and Offa. Offa, who ruled from 757 to 796, styled himself King of the English and built Offa's Dyke, a massive earthwork running along the border with Wales. He corresponded with Charlemagne as an equal, but the Viking invasions of the 9th century shattered the balance of power. As we discussed, the great heathen army conquered Northumbria, East Anglia, and much of Mercia. Only Wessex under Alfred the Great survived. Alfred and his successors gradually reconquered the Danelaw, and by the mid-10th century, England was united under a single Anglo-Saxon monarchy. The kings of Wessex became kings of all England. Edgar the Peaceful, who ruled from 959 to 975, was crowned in a ceremony that emphasized his rule over a unified kingdom. His reign was a time of relative peace and prosperity. Monastic reform, led by figures like Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, revitalized the English church, but the peace didn't last. After Edgar's death, the succession was disputed. His son, Ethelred II, who ruled from 978 to 1016, faced renewed Viking attacks. Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark invaded, and Ethelred was forced into exile. England was conquered by the Danes, and Sweyn's son Canute became King of England in 1016. Canute ruled England, Denmark, and Norway, creating a North Sea empire. He was a capable ruler and a Christian, integrating England into his Scandinavian realm. But after his death in 1035, his empire fell apart, and the English throne eventually returned to the old Wessex line with Edward the Confessor. Anglo-Saxon England was a sophisticated kingdom by the end of the Dark Ages. It had a system of law codes, a coinage, administrative divisions called shires, governed by sheriffs, and a written language. Old English literature flourished, including heroic poetry like Beowulf and religious works. The church in England was closely tied to the monarchy. Bishops and abbots were often royal appointees and served as advisors and administrators. Monasteries held vast estates and wielded economic and political power. The church provided education, charity, and a link to the wider Christian world. England at the end of the Dark Ages was prosperous and relatively stable, but it was about to face another conquest. In 1066, William the Conqueror, Duke of Normandy, would invade and fundamentally transform England, but that is the beginning of a new age. Chapter 14. Daily Life in the Church. Throughout the Dark Ages, the Church was not just a religious institution, but a central part of daily life, governance, and culture. Let us consider the Church's role more closely. For most people, the parish church was the centre of their spiritual and social life. Every village had a church, often a simple wooden or stone building with a single room. The parish priest, who might be only marginally literate and might have a wife or concubine, despite official prohibitions, conducted services, baptized infants, performed marriages, and buried the dead. The Mass, the central Christian ritual, was conducted in Latin, a language most people didn't understand. The priest stood at the altar with his back to the congregation, murmuring the sacred words. People participated by standing, kneeling, and watching. The Eucharist, believed to be the body and blood of Christ, was the focus of devotion. The church calendar structured the year. Advent prepared for Christmas, the celebration of Christ's birth. Lent was a time of fasting before Easter, the celebration of Christ's resurrection. Pentecost celebrated the descent of the Holy Spirit. Numerous saints' feast days marked the calendar. These feast days were often times of rest from work, community gatherings, and festivities. Tithes, a tenth of one's produce, were owed to the church. These supported the priest and the church building. People also made offerings for services like baptisms and burials. The church accumulated significant wealth, owning vast estates worked by peasants. Bishops, who oversaw groups of parishes called dioceses, were powerful figures, often from noble families. They lived in cities, presided over cathedrals, and wielded both spiritual and temporal authority. Many bishops were involved in royal government, serving as advisors, diplomats, and administrators. Monasticism, as we've discussed, offered an alternative to worldly life. Men and women could enter monasteries and convents, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Monastic life was structured around the divine office, a cycle of prayers conducted at set times throughout the day and night. Monks and nuns also worked, studied, and engaged in charity. Monasteries and convents varied greatly in size and wealth. Some were small, poor communities struggling to survive. Others, like Cluny in Burgundy, founded in 910, were vast, wealthy, and influential. Cluny became the centre of a reform movement, emphasising strict observance of the rule of Saint Benedict and independence from lay control. The church also provided the only formal education available. Monastic and cathedral schools taught reading, writing, Latin, and the liberal arts. These schools were intended primarily to train clergy, but some laymen, particularly nobles, also received education. The church's moral teachings shaped behaviour, or at least the ideal of behaviour. The church condemned violence, though it often blessed warriors and their weapons. It taught that marriage was indissoluble, though divorce and remarriage, particularly among the powerful, were not uncommon. It condemned usury, lending money at interest, though ways around the prohibition were found. It promoted charity, care for the poor, and hospitality. Pilgrimage was an important practice. People travelled, sometimes great distances, to visit the shrines of saints, seeking healing, forgiveness, or spiritual merit. Rome, Jerusalem, and Santiago de Compostela in Spain were major pilgrimage sites, but there were countless local shrines as well. Relics, the physical remains of saints or objects associated with them, were highly valued. A monastery or church with an important relic could attract pilgrims and donations. Relics were believed to have miraculous powers, able to heal the sick, protect against evil, and sanctify a place. The trade in relics, including fake relics, was widespread. The church's power and wealth also bred resentment and corruption. Bishops and abbots sometimes lived like princes, indulging in luxury. The buying and selling of church offices, called simony, was common. Priests sometimes neglected their duties. Reformers periodically arose, calling for a return to apostolic poverty and purity. Despite its flaws, the church was indispensable. It provided meaning, community, comfort in suffering, and hope for salvation. It preserved learning, promoted charity, and offered a vision of a world ordered by divine justice. To understand the Dark Ages, one must understand the church, for the church was woven into the fabric of life in a way difficult for us to imagine today. Chapter 15. The World Beyond Europe. While our focus has been on Europe, it's worth pausing to consider what was happening elsewhere in the world during the Dark Ages, for history is not confined to a single continent. In China, the Dark Ages period corresponds roughly to the Sui and Tang dynasties. After centuries of division, the Sui dynasty reunified China in 589. The Sui emperors undertook massive projects, including the Grand Canal, which connected northern and southern China. But the dynasty was short-lived, overthrown in 618 by the Tang. The Tang dynasty, which ruled from 618 to 907, is considered a golden age of Chinese civilization. China was prosperous, powerful, and culturally vibrant. The Tang capital, Chang'an, was the largest city in the world, with over 1 million inhabitants. Chinese poetry, painting, and ceramics flourished. Buddhism, which had entered China centuries earlier, became deeply rooted. The Tang also expanded westward along the Silk Road, coming into contact with Islamic civilization. In India, the Gupta Empire, which had presided over a classical age, declined in the 6th century under pressure from the Huns. India fragmented into regional kingdoms. Hinduism was the dominant religion, but Buddhism remained significant. Indian mathematics and astronomy were highly advanced. The concept of zero and the decimal system, which would revolutionize mathematics, were developed in India and later transmitted to the Islamic world and then to Europe. In the Americas, civilizations rose and fell without any contact with the Old World. The Maya in Mesoamerica reached their classical peak between about 250 and 900, building cities with pyramids, developing a complex writing system, and making astronomical calculations. Around 900, many Mayan cities were mysteriously abandoned, possibly due to environmental degradation, warfare, or drought. In South America, the city of Tiwanaku near Lake Titicaca in the Andes became a major center. In North America, the Mississippian culture was beginning to develop, eventually creating large settlements like Cahokia. In sub-Saharan Africa, the kingdom of Aksum in modern Ethiopia was a Christian kingdom that had existed since ancient times. It declined in the 7th century, but left a legacy, including the unique rock-hewn churches of Lalibela. In West Africa, the Ghana Empire, not located in modern Ghana but further north, grew wealthy, controlling trans-Saharan trade in gold and salt. In Southeast Asia, the Srivijaya Empire, based in Sumatra, controlled maritime trade routes between India and China. In Japan, the Nara and Heian periods saw the adoption of Chinese governmental models, the spread of Buddhism, and the development of a distinctive Japanese culture. These civilizations, though distant from Europe, were not entirely isolated. Trade routes, particularly the Silk Road across Central Asia and maritime routes across the Indian Ocean, connected distant regions. Goods, ideas, and technologies travelled these routes. Chinese silk reached Rome. Roman glassware reached China. Indian numerals reached the Islamic world, and then Europe. The rise of Islam, as we've discussed, connected the Mediterranean, the Middle East, Central Asia, and eventually parts of Africa and Southeast Asia into a vast zone of cultural and economic exchange. Islamic civilization borrowed from Byzantine, Persian, Indian, and other traditions, creating a cosmopolitan culture. Europe during the Dark Ages was, in many ways, a backwater compared to the Tang dynasty in China or the Abbasid Caliphate in the Islamic world. But Europe's relative isolation and fragmentation during this period would not last. In the centuries after 1000, Europe would begin to expand economically, politically, and intellectually, eventually becoming a major global force. Chapter 16: Technological and Agricultural Developments. While the Dark Ages are often portrayed as a time of stagnation, there were in fact gradual technological and agricultural developments that laid the groundwork for later medieval prosperity. The heavy plough, which we mentioned earlier, was a significant innovation. Unlike the light scratch plough used in the Mediterranean, which barely broke the surface, the heavy plough could turn over the thick, wet soils of northern Europe. It had a coulter to cut the soil, a ploughshare to lift it, and a mould board to turn it over. The heavy plough required a team of oxen to pull, which meant cooperation among peasants who pulled their animals. The horse collar, which appeared in Europe during the early medieval period, possibly from China, was another important innovation. Earlier, harnesses pressed against a horse's windpipe, limiting its pulling power. The horse collar distributed the load across the horse's shoulders, allowing it to pull much heavier loads. Horses, being faster than oxen, could plough more land in a day. The use of horses in agriculture increased productivity, though horses were more expensive to maintain than oxen, requiring oats rather than just grazing. The three-field system of crop rotation, which spread during the Carolingian period and later, improved on the earlier two-field system. In the two-field system, half the land was planted with winter wheat or rye, and half was left fallow. In the three-field system, one field was planted in autumn with winter wheat or rye. One field was planted in spring with oats, barley, or legumes, and one field was left fallow. This system increased the amount of land under cultivation at any given time and diversified crops, reducing the risk of famine. Watermills and windmills became increasingly common. Watermills, which used flowing water to turn a wheel and grind grain, had existed since Roman times, but became more widespread. The Domesday Book, a survey of England conducted in 1086, just after our period, records thousands of watermills. Windmills, which appeared in Europe around the 12th century, also provided mechanical power. In metallurgy, improvements in forging and smelting techniques produced better iron and steel. Iron tools and weapons became more common and more durable. Blacksmiths were essential members of any community, producing and repairing ploughs, horseshoes, nails, and weapons. In construction, techniques evolved. Stone castles began to replace wooden fortifications. Romanesque architecture, characterized by thick walls, round arches, and massive pillars, developed in the 10th and 11th centuries. Churches became larger and more elaborate, testaments to both faith and engineering skill. In warfare, the stirrup, which may have been introduced to Europe from Central Asia in the early medieval period, revolutionized cavalry tactics. The stirrup allowed a rider to stay mounted while wielding a lance or sword with much greater force, making heavy cavalry a dominant force on the battlefield. The rise of armoured knights as the elite fighting force shaped medieval society, leading to the feudal system where land was granted in exchange for military service. These technological developments were gradual and uneven. Different regions adopted innovations at different rates, but cumulatively they increased agricultural productivity, supported population growth, and laid the foundation for the economic and cultural flourishing of the High Middle Ages. Chapter 17: Population and Urbanization. The population of Europe declined significantly after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. War, disease, particularly the Justinianic plague, and economic disruption all took their toll. Cities shrank or were abandoned. Trade routes were disrupted. The Western Mediterranean, once a thriving network of commerce, became more dangerous and less active. By the 7th and 8th centuries, Europe's population was probably at its lowest point since before the Roman conquest. Estimates are uncertain, but the population of Western Europe may have been only half or even a third of what it had been at the height of the Roman Empire. Urban life, which had been central to Roman civilization, declined dramatically in the West. Cities like Rome, which had housed over 1 million people at its peak, shrank to perhaps 30 or 40,000 by the 8th century. Other cities were even smaller. In many regions, urban life nearly disappeared, and Europe became overwhelmingly rural. Bishops and church institutions often kept cities alive. The bishop's church, the cathedral, remained a focal point. Markets, though smaller than in Roman times, continued to function. Some cities, like Pavia in Italy or Reims in France, served as royal or administrative centres, but compared to Roman times, cities were shadows of their former selves. However, the population decline eventually bottomed out. By the 9th and 10th centuries, there are signs of recovery. Agricultural improvements increased food production. The climate during this period was relatively warm and stable, supporting good harvests. The cessation of major invasions by the late 10th century provided stability. Population began to grow again, slowly at first, then more rapidly. With population growth came renewed urbanization. Old Roman cities began to expand beyond their ancient walls. New towns were founded, particularly in regions undergoing economic development. Markets and trade fairs became more common and more active. Certain regions became particularly urbanized. Italy, which had maintained more of its Roman urban tradition, saw cities like Venice, Genoa, Pisa, and Milan grow wealthy through trade. In Flanders, in the Low Countries, cities like Bruges and Ghent prospered from the wool trade. In Germany, towns along the Rhine and in other regions became centres of commerce. By the year 1000, Europe was on the cusp of a period of significant growth. The population was rising, agriculture was improving, trade was reviving, and a new dynamism was emerging. The Dark Ages, in the sense of a period of decline and stagnation, were ending. The High Middle Ages, a period of economic expansion, cultural flourishing, and increasing political complexity, were beginning. Chapter 18. The Legacy of the Dark Ages. As we approach the year 1000, it's worth reflecting on the legacy of the Dark Ages and what this period meant for European civilization. The Dark Ages were a time of transformation. The Western Roman Empire, a vast, centralized, urbanized, and sophisticated state, fell apart. In its place emerged a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and lordships. Political fragmentation replaced unity. Local power replaced centralized administration. A rural agrarian economy replaced the monetized, trade-based economy of Rome. But this was not simply a story of decline. New political entities emerged that would shape European history. The kingdoms of France, Germany, England, Spain, and others trace their origins to this period. The Carolingian Empire, though it fragmented, established the idea of a Christian empire in the West and created institutions and cultural models that endured. The Church became the dominant cultural force. Christianity spread to every corner of Europe, creating a shared religious identity. Monasticism preserved learning and provided a model of disciplined community life. The alliance between secular rulers and the Church became a defining feature of medieval Europe. Feudalism, the system of reciprocal obligations based on land tenure, emerged during this period. Lords granted land to vassals in exchange for military service. Peasants worked the land and provided labour in exchange for protection. This system, though often harsh and exploitative, provided a degree of order and stability in a world without strong central government. Culturally, the Dark Ages saw the blending of Roman, Germanic, and Christian traditions. Latin remained the language of learning and the Church, but vernacular languages like Old English, Old French, and Old High German developed and eventually produced rich literatures. Artistic styles evolved, blending classical, Byzantine, and barbarian influences. Technologically, as we've discussed, gradual improvements in agriculture, metallurgy, and other fields laid the groundwork for later prosperity. The three-field system, the heavy plough, the horse collar, water mills, all contributed to increased productivity. Intellectually, the Dark Ages were a time of preservation and slow rebuilding. The classics of Greece and Rome were copied and studied in monasteries. The works of the Church Fathers were read and commented upon. New works were written, like Bede's Ecclesiastical History and Einhard's Life of Charlemagne. Islamic scholars preserved and advanced Greek philosophy and science, which would later be transmitted back to Europe. The term Dark Ages suggests ignorance and barbarism, and there was certainly violence, illiteracy, and hardship. But there was also continuity, creativity, and the gradual construction of a new civilization. Europe in 1000 was very different from Europe in 500, but it was not inferior. It was different, with its own achievements and its own character. By the year 1000, Europe was poised for growth. The population was increasing, agriculture was improving, trade was reviving. New religious and intellectual movements were stirring. The Crusades, the rise of universities, the construction of great Gothic cathedrals, the flourishing of medieval philosophy and literature all lay ahead. The Dark Ages, in ending, gave birth to the medieval world. And the medieval world, in turn, would lay the foundations for the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, and the modern world. History is a continuous stream, each age building on the last, and the Dark Ages, for all their challenges, were an essential chapter in the story of Western civilization. We have travelled together through 5 centuries, from the fall of the Western Roman Empire in the late 5th century to the threshold of the High Middle Ages around the year 1000. We've witnessed the fragmentation of Rome, the rise of Germanic kingdoms, the spread of Christianity, the birth of Islam, the conquests of Charlemagne, the terror of Viking raids, the struggles of Byzantium, and the slow rebuilding of European civilization. The Dark Ages were not as dark as once believed. They were a time of change, of challenge, of new beginnings. They saw the emergence of the nations and cultures that would define Europe. They saw the preservation of knowledge and the foundation of new traditions. They were, in truth, a bridge between the ancient world and the medieval world. As you drift towards sleep, let these images and stories fade into the background. The emperors and kings, the saints and scholars, the warriors and peasants, all fade into history's long procession. Their struggles and achievements, their hopes and fears, are now distant echoes. Rest well, knowing that history is vast and deep, an endless river flowing from the past into the future. And in that river, we are all carried along, part of a story much larger than ourselves. Good night.